has disproven the idea of God. And they go on to say, people who believe in God are backwards, uneducated, illogical, and superstitious. That's how our skeptical friends view those of us who believe in God. I want to thank you for being here this afternoon. I want to thank this congregation for having us here for these few days. We've gotten to do this several times, and we are thankful to be together again to be able to present this information. And when you've got three friends who are as good of friends as these are to me, it's a blessing to be able to be with all of them. So what is science? Science is actually, according to the Oxford Dictionary, the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. Sean had a lot to say about that in some fashion earlier, and that was an outstanding lesson just a few moments ago. But my task in this afternoon's lesson is to talk about some extra-biblical scientific evidences for God and for creation. Turn in your Bibles to Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1. And while you are, one of the most famous, well-known atheists of the last generation was Carl Sagan. And Carl Sagan made a statement that I completely agree with. And that is, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I believe that to be true. The extraordinary claims that we believe to be true about God and the Bible and the resurrection, they must have extraordinary evidence, and we've heard quite a bit about that so far. But when it comes to the idea that God exists and the evidences that are in creation itself, they are also extraordinary. And so we're going to take a look at some of those. Romans chapter 1, Bruce read this in your hearing this morning, but go back up to verse 18 again. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. How did God make it evident to us about His existence? Well, for since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen. His eternal power and divine nature have been understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and of birds, and of four-footed animals, and crawling creatures. One of my favorite statements in Scripture is in these verses. And that is, His invisible attributes are clearly seen. You know, sometimes among brethren you'll have this discussion that takes place. A command, example, necessary inference. Okay, I get command. I kind of get example. Necessary inference, people just made that up. That's not real. Wait a minute. He used necessary inference to show proof that God exists, evidence that God exists. Notice His invisible attributes are clearly seen how? By necessary implication through what He has made. And that's an important principle for Bible study, period, that we need to hold on to. But you know, as this discussion goes forth, God has put within the creation itself many evidences for His divine power and for His divinity. And this is not about a conflict between religion versus science. There are people who are devoutly religious who are also very scientific in their approach to the world. This is not about educated people versus uneducated people. This is not about superstitious people versus scientifically disposed people. That's not what this is about at all. And I know that science in the minds of some has replaced the concept of religion, but my friends, if you do science right, what will you understand? His divine power and His divine nature are clearly shown by looking at the creation that God has given. Reality is, there have been a lot of famous people in history who are at the heart of the scientific principle because they did so many things to help us understand scientific ways of doing things, and yet they still believed in a creator God. Leonardo da Vinci, who did not write the Da Vinci Code, by the way, and he did not call on Tom Hanks to be the lead in the movie either, but Leonardo da Vinci was a scientist. He was an inventor. And Leonardo da Vinci believed in a creator God. He's not the only one. Robert Boyle, who is very important when it comes to the scientific principle. He was involved in chemistry, and yet we see he also believed strongly in God. One of the ones we hear about a lot, Sir Isaac Newton. When it comes to gravity and when it comes to astronomy, he was very important in what we do today. We understand things today a lot because of his discoveries, and he also famously believed in God. Even Albert Einstein. Now, did Einstein believe in God like we do? No. But the idea that God is somehow out there and involved in the creation, we see that he believed in that, and he is one of the most famous ones that we are aware of. And then there's Cambridge-educated Stephen Meyer. And let's notice a quotation, or some quotations from him. And the first of those that we're going to notice is this. He says, I believe that the testimony of science supports theism. That's what this whole weekend is about. Supports theism. While there will always be points of tension or unresolved conflict, as Sean talked about in his a moment ago, the major developments in science in the last 5 decades have been running in a strongly theistic direction. He paused momentarily and then punched his conclusion. Science done right points toward God. And when you think about it, if in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, then will not all properly done scientific investigation point back to Him? So what do? Well, we have to put the evidence in the scales and see where it goes. And this is not new. This is found throughout Scripture, as Bruce and Sean have both talked about today. The idea that we must look at the evidence and see where the evidence leads. And rather than just superstitiously believing what we believe because God has given us too much evidence to not. God has always demanded that of His people. In John chapter 20, we're not going to turn there, but in John 20, truly many other signs did Jesus in the presence of His disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and that believing you may have life in His name. My friends, Jesus did not work the miracles that He did or even rise from the dead just to do some amazing things. He did those to show that He was who He said He was, the Christ and the Son of the living God. And as we noticed in Romans chapter 1, and as Bruce also read from Psalm 19, God built into the creation evidences that show His handiwork. And that's what my lesson this afternoon is all about. The evidences that God has built into the creation itself. Let's start with the first law of thermodynamics. Again, as you've heard 2 others already say today, not probably something we talk about all the time. But the first law of thermodynamics is, according to Isaac Asimov, the most fundamental principle of science. And it's something along this line. Matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed, though they can be transformed from one form into another. By the way, if it can't be created or destroyed, then how did everything come to be? Is it eternal? Has matter and energy always existed? Or does not this principle itself point toward the idea that there had to be a beginning at some point, and from that point, it can't be created or destroyed? This idea of transformation, we're familiar with this. We start out with the, not quite so attractive caterpillar, and then we go to the even less attractive chrysalis, but then ultimately we have the transformation into the beautiful butterfly. And that's a pretty fair illustration of the first law of thermodynamics. The matter and energy that are involved in those three are neither created nor destroyed, but they're transformed from one form into another. So in the first law of thermodynamics, which is called the law of the conservation of energy, the idea is also found in Scripture. Turn to Hebrews chapter 1 with me. Hebrews chapter 1. And this principle we find in Hebrews 1. We find it in Psalm 102 and other places. But in Hebrews chapter 1, beginning with verse 1, it says, God, after He spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets in many portions and in many ways, in these last days He has spoken to us through His Son, whom He appointed heir of all things, through whom also He made the world, there's creation, and He is the radiance of His glory and the exact representation of His nature, here we go, and upholds all things by the word of His power. Upholds all things by the word of His power. That is a biblical way of mentioning the first law of thermodynamics. As long as God intends for the universe to exist, it will exist. The first law of thermodynamics will be in place. Matter and energy will neither be created nor be destroyed, because conservation is in place. And biblically we see that is even addressed. But then we come to what used to be my personal favorite scientific evidence for God in creation, and that is the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics is also described as the law of the increase of entropy. Entropy, another one of our favorite words. Entropy means disorder. It means randomness. In other words, it is a description of things deteriorating, things running downhill, things that are not working as well as they used to. And as I look in the mirror, I see a few things that don't. That's the second law of thermodynamics in play. So everything runs down. Your cell phone runs down. You know, I used to have this flip phone. I love that thing. You could just flip it open and put it right against your ear, and I could hear. It sounded great. And then I don't have a flip phone anymore because they don't make them quite that often, and you can't surf the internet on it, which is a whole other deal. But anyway, the human body, the sun, the universe. Did you know that every scientist, whether a scientist who believes in God or a scientist who is an atheist, they all agree on this: the entire universe is running down. Now, when you think about the second law of thermodynamics, you can also illustrate like this. You like bananas? You go to the store, you buy bananas, you put them on the shelf, and the first one's just too green. The second one, that's about right for me. I can eat that third one. But when you get to that fourth one, you make banana bread. That's the second law of thermodynamics. That's how it works. Everything runs down. But when you think about that, God made everything good. Genesis 1, God said this, and God spoke this into existence. And what did God say after every one of those things? It was good. It was good. And then we come to Genesis 3. And in Genesis 3, when sin enters the world, from that point forward, not everything's good anymore. It starts to run down. And thus the second law of thermodynamics in earnest was introduced when we come to Genesis chapter 3. If you're still in Hebrews chapter 1. I should have told you to hold your finger there. But if you're still in Hebrews chapter 1, let's go a little further into the chapter. And here he quotes Psalm 102. Come down to verse 10 with me, if you will. Hebrews 1 and verse 10. He says, "And you, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all become old, like a garment, and like a mantle you will roll them up. Like a garment, they will also be changed. But you are the same, and your years do not end." My friends, the completed creation since Genesis 3 has been running down. That is the second law of thermodynamics. But that brings up this point. If according to the laws of physics, number one, first law of thermodynamics, energy and matter can neither be created nor destroyed, not by natural processes, that leaves what? That leaves someone who is beyond nature, who could start that in the first place. Second law of thermodynamics, everything that is physical, material, is running down. The use of matter and energy deteriorates in how things hold together over time. And since there is no purely physical principle that could show how everything continues to go, then that means there must have been a cause that is above nature and before creation who brought it all into existence in the first place. The first and second laws of thermodynamics are powerful evidence for belief in God and creation. But that's not all. Symbiosis. Symbiosis is the idea of the flowers and the bees, the process of pollination. Without the flowers and pollen, the bees can't make their honey and survival is impossible. But without the bees, pollination for the flowers cannot occur, and thus they cannot continue. So when you have a symbiotic relationship like that, both had to be in existence from the very beginning of the survival of either. Can you imagine? Okay, you have kind of a half bee and kind of a half pollinating flower, but somehow, well, the half bee can't pollinate and the half flower can't be pollinated, so you have to have fully mature systems that work interactively for the survival of each. That speaks to evidence for God and for creation who made things whole from the very beginning. Secondly, when you define evolution, and I think it's important to do that in order to proceed a little further in what we're talking about today, it's important that we get our terms right. You know, evolution, somebody says, science has proven evolution. All right, hold the phone. What do you mean by that? And then we'll talk a little further, because the reality is macroevolution has not been proven. This is the one they want to say has been proven, but it has not been proven. Macroevolution is major evolutionary change. It applies mainly to the evolution of whole taxonomic groups over long periods of time. So you had this idea that there were ape-like creatures, and Lucy was the very first one, and then over time it progressed, and finally you had Neanderthals, and then ultimately you have us. That's not been proven. They're saying that it has. They're acting as if it were. But it is not. It is the idea of amoeba to ape to human and everything else. The other way of talking about evolution, though, is microevolution. This is evolutionary change within a species or small group of organisms, especially over a, at least relatively, short period of time. An illustration of this would be, there are a lot of different breeds of dogs. We have this hairy beast at home. He weighs about 100 pounds. He's part American Bulldog, and he's part Australian. So kind of looks like an American bulldog with long, shaggy hair. He's beautiful. Okay, maybe I'm stretching it a little bit. His name is Buford, but I'm a Texan, so his nickname, Bubba. My kids have a very small dog with very short hair who doesn't bark nearly as loud as Buford and doesn't eat nearly as much, but they're both dogs. That's variation within the species. That is scientifically and properly understood. But you know, macroevolution is really, it's more of a philosophy. And it's philosophy they have adopted because they reject the idea of creation where everything is made whole at the very beginning, and rather we have to start with very small and very simple cellular creatures that eventually grow into something else, and then a whole lot of other things develop. And you are a very good man. I don't care what anybody else says. Thank you, Tyler. And macroevolution has not been proven. So when you think about the geologic column, you look at the record of the rocks and you ask the question, okay, so the evolutionist believes, that the macroevolutionist believes that you can look at what we see in the record of the rocks and we can see this macroevolution taking place. Well, Stephen Meyer says Darwin's theory predicts a long history of gradual divergence from a common ancestor, with the differences slowly becoming bigger and bigger until you get the major differences we have now. Looks something like this. So you have at the bottom the first true cells, but those first true cells, oh, just wonderfully, amazingly, they began to develop, and all of a sudden you have this kind of creature and that kind of creature, and it keeps branching off until finally you get insects on the one side and other animals on the other side, and humans at the pinnacle of the whole thing. And that's what they think they should be able to find when they do geological investigation. Well, actually, the evolutionary tree, which we just had on the board, looks different than what they actually see. Let's listen to Stephen Meyer a little more. The fossil evidence, even in his day, Darwin's day, showed the opposite. The rapid appearance of phylum-level differences in what's called the Cambrian explosion. So you look at the evidence in the geologic column, and rather than, okay, we start with this kind of creature, and we can see that it developed into this kind of creature, and then into this, and then into this, and then ultimately here we are. Instead of that, what we see is, all of a sudden, various different kinds of creatures fully developed. Darwin believed that the future of fossil discoveries would vindicate his theory, but that hasn't happened. Actually, fossil discoveries over the last 150 years have turned his tree upside down by showing the Cambrian explosion was even more abrupt and extensive than scientists thought. So here's what the macroevolutionist says it ought to look like. Here's what it really looks like. The one on the bottom. Now, the creation model would predict that God in a 6 of the 7 day week created everything good and whole from the beginning. And you would expect from that model to see in the record of the rocks what we see at the bottom. The macroevolutionist says, no, we started as simple creatures, and then over eons of time we developed into something else, and they would predict that the upper tree would be the case. What do we see in the fossil record? We see the one on the bottom, not the one that would be predicted by macroevolution. But I want to show you some examples of what we're talking about as we consider the geologic column. One of the claims that the macroevolutionist makes is that fossilization takes hundreds of thousands of years, thousands and thousands, in order to develop. And so you've heard it before, you find this piece of petrified wood, and they'll say, yeah, it took thousands and thousands of years for that petrified wood to be developed. to go from the soft and porous wood to be replaced by minerals and thus be rock, it took thousands and thousands of years for that to take place. So my friends, what we see is that there are actually many examples where rapid fossilization had to be what took place. Now, this is a 30-foot tall tree. I haven't measured yet. I've got a reason to measure before tomorrow evening how tall this ceiling is. So I haven't measured that yet, but this 30-foot tree is taller than this ceiling because that's not 30 feet, at least not here. And if you'll notice in this, you have coal seams in different places. You can see the darker places where coal seams are. You can also see there are various layers of strata. Layer, 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 many layers. You can't even count all the layers just on the photograph, but it's obvious how many layers that there are many layers on this in strata. Now think about this. If each layer of strata took thousands of years, let's reduce the number down for absurdity. Let's say that it took 100 years for each layer of strata to be laid down. Okay? By the time you got this layer of strata, this layer of dirt laid down to cover it up, what would happen to the rest of the tree by 100 years? It would rot, and it would fall over, and it wouldn't still be a tree. Everything else would be gone, and only the bottom part would be in a layer of strata that might have a chance to fossilize. That's it. So if you have 1,000 years, 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 30 feet worth of 1,000 years, various different layers of strata, did that happen over a long period of time? Or were not those layers of strata laid down relatively quickly before the rest could rot? My wife and I went to Yellowstone 32 years ago. 32 years ago, next month, we went to Yellowstone. And we're driving around and we go into this parking lot and we're going to look at some things, and we drive in, and when we do, we see a number of fossilized trees, upright fossilized trees that have been uncovered from the strata. It was amazing. For those things to fossilize, it had to happen fairly rapidly, or decomposition would have taken place and there would be nothing there but dirt for us to see. So rapid fossilization is a real consideration. Look at this other example. This is the ichthyosaur. And notice how complete the ichthyosaur is. But then notice something a little fascinating about this. The ichthyosaur is actually giving birth. And in the fossilization of this particular ichthyosaur, it's fossilized quickly enough and completely enough that the young is still there in the process. So, has anybody ever gone on a trip and said, hey, will you water my plants for me? Will you take care of my plants while I'm gone? Anybody ever ask you to do that? You know how many people have asked me to do that? Zero. You know why? Because brown thumb, not going to work. But of all the plants that I might be asked to take care of, ferns are probably way down on the list, because if you don't take care of ferns properly and quickly, they will wilt, and the different portions of the leaf will start to fall off, and it doesn't take very long. This is a fossilized fern. But I want you to notice something about it. First of all, notice just how plump each portion of this fern frond is. It doesn't look like your typical fern would after 2 days of not being very well taken care of. It doesn't look like that, does it? No, they're plump. Secondly, I want you to notice the ribbing in each part of the frond. Folks, that fossilization happened quick. It happened quick. It could not have happened over thousands of years of time. Consider another example. This is at a municipal building in Kentucky. And you may notice I have Bible CA on a lot of the pictures that I'm using. And the reason for that is because that site that our brother in Christ has put up has a lot of photographs of different fossils and so forth. Don Patton has been involved in some of those, and I've interacted with him a lot about this in the last 30 years. But in that municipal building, and these pictures were taken several years ago. Here in just a minute you'll say, oh yeah, that was taken several years ago. But this building was built in like the 40s. And you have stalactites in the basement of this municipal building that has been around no longer since the 1940s. And here's how you know it's been a while ago. I think we're going back to the 70s probably for this picture. You have a young man who is standing in the very same basement in a different spot. And here we have stalagmite. And it's a pretty large one. And this building's only existed since about the 40s. In a relatively short period of time, both of those were developed. And then another one. This one's pretty interesting. You know what that is encrusted in the top of that stalagmite? It's a bat. Can you see that the skin is still there? It was fossilized or encrusted in that stalagmite quickly enough that the skin of the bat didn't even have time to decompose before it happened. All fossils, that just takes thousands and thousands of years. Well, here's some examples where that's not exactly the case. You know, I told you earlier that the first law of thermodynamics, or second law of thermodynamics, used to be my favorite scientific evidence for faith in God. I've got a new one. Last number of years, and it is probability, also known as irreducible complexity. That is, there are some things that are so complex you can't reduce them down to where it could have happened in some evolutionary way. Now, let's start very simple with our illustration. 5 books and a bookshelf. Okay, every good preacher I know loves books. Present company included. So, 5 books and a bookshelf. What is the probability if I were to say to my beautiful wife, all right, honey, take these 5 books and just guess what order I want them in and put them on the bookshelf. What is the probability that she will get it exactly right? Now, she's really smart, so that's going to improve her chances. She knows me really well. That's also going to improve the chances. But let's say just by random, she just closed her eyes and picked one, said, okay, this one's first, and so forth. What's the probability she would do it correctly? Well, there are many ways to order them on your shelf, but how many exactly? Well, if you have 5 items, mathematicians use what they call factorials in order to figure this out. And the formula for a factorial goes like this. You take the number of objects that you have, and you multiply that, and that will give you an answer. And then you have a 1 out of whatever that number is that you get, a 1 out of that many chance of just by randomness getting it exactly right. Now, I know it has an exclamation mark by it. That does not mean we're excited about the number 5. That's how you know it means factorial. So 5 factorial is 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5. And all you good mathematicians out there with a good calculator on your phone know the answer is 120. So there are 120 different ways. Think about this. Only 5 books. There are 120 different ways to order those books on a bookshelf. Wow, first of all. Second of all, to get that right the first time, it is a 0.083333 chance, I don't like my chances, of that happening just by some random process with my wife closing her eyes and grabbing a book and handing it to me. But you know what? That's a pretty small number. Look at this factorial chart. So 5 items, 5 factorial is 120, 1 out of 120 chance. Come down to 9 factorial, a 1 out of 362,880 chance. I really don't like my chances. And with the number 12, only 12 items, it's almost 1 out of a 500 million chance you'd get it right randomly without someone with intelligence doing it. Well, think about this. The simplest forms of life, an amoeba, the simplest forms of life have millions of parts. Not 5 parts where it's 1 out of 120 chance, or 9 parts where it's 1 out of 362,000 chance, or 12 parts where it's 1 out of a 500 million chance. No, we have millions of parts just to randomly come together and form an amoeba? Really? How about a human? A human is composed of 60 trillion cells. Sometimes I feel like I've got a few more than that. But 60 trillion cells. Oh, wait a minute. It's worse than that, though, because each cell has millions of parts. And then the 60 trillion cells have to come together in a certain way. I don't really like my chances of some evolutionary process causing that to be able to come about. So if purely by chance, what are the chances of you just happening? Or of humanity just occurring? What are the chances of that? Think about someone with Down syndrome. Down syndrome is a small chromosomal difficulty. And look at all the health issues that someone with Down syndrome has. One small change. The reality is that you look at these things that God has created, and it's just amazing. And it obviously shows intelligence. Think about the human skeleton, for example. The human skeleton is composed of 206 bones. So if you use factorials, that's 10 to the 388th power. That's a 1 followed by 388 zeros. So, as we say, you shake them bones, and what are the chances they're just going to fall into place and exactly there? It's a 1 out of that. And it's only 206. I don't like my chances. The mousetrap is a simple apparatus. It has just a few parts that are involved. You have the hammer, you have the spring, you have the catch, you have the platform, you have the holding bar. And Michael Behe used this very famously in one of his books as he discussed this. And we've got our number from earlier with the books. Because there are 5 parts, it's 5 factorial. It's a 0.08333 chance that just randomly you'd be able to figure that out. And yet here we are talking about cells, and somebody thinks that just happened accidentally by random processes through evolution. That's a lot of happy accidents. That's a lot of luck. That's a lot of, it just didn't happen that way. Think about the Earth's distance from the sun. If the Earth is a little closer, it's even hotter than it is in San Antonio, Texas right now. If the Earth is a little further from the sun, we freeze. If the axis of the Earth is pointed just a little bit too far, one way or the other, the Earth doesn't work, and we can't survive. DNA code. We've learned a lot about the DNA code in the last number of years. Evolutionist Richard Dawkins of Oxford said the machine code of the genes is uncannily computer-like. Oh, but it just happened accidentally, right, Mr. Dawkins? That's what he's going to say. Just happened accidentally. Oh, but wait a minute. He can't describe how DNA works without using phrases like machine code. Now, if you've got machine code, you've got a machine, and you've got code, and you've got somebody who codes it. And then he says it's computer-like. If you've got a computer, then you've got something that was developed to work a certain way. That's the way the DNA code works. Doesn't that speak of a programmer? Doesn't that speak of a designer? He's not only an evolutionist. He's an atheistic evolutionist. Yet he's speaking in terms like that. You know, the father of modern atheism was a gentleman by the name of Anthony Flew. Bruce mentioned him this morning. He might come up again before the week is out. Anthony Flew was so dedicated to his atheism and so famous for it. I've got two of the debates that he had where he took the side opposing God's existence. I used to have a third. I lost it. Don't know what happened to it. Random, I guess. Random chance, I guess. I don't know. But he was very famous for debating atheism. He was very famous as a philosopher. But Anthony Flew made the following statement: I now believe there is a God. Late in his life, he changed his mind. I now believe there is a God. I now think that that is the evidence, does point to a creative intelligence almost entirely because of DNA investigations. That's what caused him to change his mind. We have all the evidence we need for the existence of God in our immediate experience, and that only a deliberate refusal to look, which he refused to look for a number of years. He actually grew up in a home where his father was a fairly well-known theologian in Great Britain. He grew up believing in God, but then he got to the point in his philosophical viewpoint that he rejected faith in God, and he debated against the existence of God. And then late in his life, DNA discovery, how it works and that kind of thing, caused him to turn back to theism. Only a deliberate refusal to look is responsible for atheism in any variety. In the last book he wrote, there is, and he has no God written down because that's what he used to believe, and then on the cover it's marked out, and there is a God. He changed his mind. He is a terrific example of looking at the evidence and seeing what we understand. So probability speaks to the incredible wisdom and power of God. It takes power and intelligence to do what chance cannot. Now this watch works. The face is a little scratched. It still works. Works great, in fact. But let's say I were to take this watch apart, put all the parts of this watch into a paper bag, and I were to shake the bag. How long would I have to shake it before I could take from the bag this watch back together and working again? I mean, we have all the right parts. We know that it works because it works right now. I've taken it apart. We have energy that's working on it. How long before it would be fully functioning again and we could just put it right back on my wrist and get back to work? We know it would never happen because it takes intelligence to do what chance and power cannot. Charles Darwin himself made the statement, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Well, Mr. Darwin, I submit to you that your theory has broken down. You know, if you were to come upon this sandcastle and you were to ask the question, how did this sandcastle get to be here? There's not a single person in the entire world, atheist or theist, who would say, random chance, accidental, just happened. Not a single one of them. But yet, when you look at human beings and you see them who are far more complex than any sandcastle, some will say random chance, accidental. But how can we believe that? My friends, it is really reasonable to believe in God. The extra biblical scientific evidence that God built into the creation gives us reason to believe in Him. Carl Sagan said extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and God in creation has given us extraordinary evidence to believe that He is and honor Him for who He is. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. We have extraordinary evidence for God. Now, tomorrow night at 7, we're going to talk about dinosaurs. But if there's any among us this afternoon who needs to obey the gospel of Jesus Christ, everything the Bible says you can believe with confidence, because God has given us evidence that He exists. God has given us evidence through the resurrection of His Son. And God has given us evidence, as Tyler talked about so capably this morning, through the written Word. Do you believe that Jesus is the Christ and Son of God? Do you believe enough that you're willing to repent, to confess your faith in Him, and to be baptized for the remission of sins? If we can help you, or if we can pray for you, we hope you'll make it known as we stand and sing together.